With Adeptus Titanicus just around the corner, I thought I would turn my attention to one of the new Tiny Titans that are being released in the new game. In this video, I'll be walking you through how I painted this Warlord Titan in the colours of the Legio Gryphonicus. Before I primed the Titan, I only partly assembled my miniature. For example, the weapons, armour plates and head have been assembled but left attached from the main body. Assembling your miniature this way makes it much easier to paint those hard to reach areas later on. To better hold onto the components, I've simply made use of a section of dowel topped with some blue tack. This will ensure that you're not getting your fingers on the component as you paint it. Next is priming, which is the important first step in painting your miniatures. It helps the layers of paint adhere to the surface correctly, giving you a far superior finish than if you hadn't. However, priming can also be used to shave off some painting time by using coloured sprays. This means you don't have to tackle these areas with a brush later on. I've opted to base coat the weapons and the body with Leadbelcher, and everything else I've used Mechanicus Standard Grey. I applied these using an airbrush over a black primer, but you could also use Games Workshop's rattle cans for the same effect instead. After priming, our first task is to paint the silver metallic areas of our components that we primed with Mechanicus Standard Grey. For this, we'll be using Leadbelcher and a regular brush. However, before applying the paint, we first of all want to water it down slightly. Thinning out the paint will not only make it easier to work with, but if we apply a couple of coats, we'll be left with a much smoother finish. So take your paint and mix it with an equal amount of water. Then, with your mixture, you can start to paint the neck of the head, as well as any support struts on your armour panels. Take care with this step as you don't want to overspill onto the grey armour panels that we'll be painting later on. We can now start to add some definition and weathering to the metal areas. For this step, I'll be applying a wash of Agrax Earthshade to everywhere that's been painted with Leadbelcher. However, before you start with your washes, I would recommend thoroughly cleaning your brushes and changing your paint water. The metallic paint that we used in the last step can leave behind metallic flakes, which, if you're not careful, can be accidentally transferred to your other non-metal areas or paints. The brown wash will flow into the recesses, helping to create shading and depth, in addition to creating a worn and slightly rusted look to the metal. The next step in painting our silver metallics is to apply a dry brush of Necron Compound. To dry brush, take a relatively large brush and dip it into your paint. Then, using a spare piece of paper or tissue, lightly remove the paint from the brush until only a small amount of paint remains spread across the bristles. Then, quickly drag the brush over the metal surfaces whilst applying only a very light amount of pressure. This will cause the bristles to only touch the more raised sections of the model, causing the paint to only accumulate on these parts. As only the most prominent areas of the surface will be painted, this helps to improve the appearance of depth and shadow. Continuing with the metallics, we are next going to be using Stormhost Silver to pick out some of the metal details. You can apply this paint to the exposed piston rods on all the various hydraulics, as well as the railings to the rear of the Titan, and finally to pick out some of those pipe details as well. As Stormhost Silver is much brighter than our previous Leadbelcher, it will really help these small details to stand out. The next metallic colour to paint are the small bronze areas of the Titan. These areas are found mainly on the Titan's torso, legs, volcano cannons, and any area that has a joint. As this is the first non-silver metallic paint that we've applied so far, take care when applying it to some of the smaller details. If you do overspill, don't worry, as these mistakes can be touched up with some Leadbelcher. With your Balthasar Gold layer dried, we can now move on to our second wash. As that concludes our application of metallics for now, make sure that you clean your brushes and change your water before proceeding. For this wash, we'll be using Seraphim Sepia, and we'll be applying it in 3 different ways. First of all, we'll be painting it over the areas we tackled in the last step. The wash will help to improve the bronze colouring of the Balthasar Gold and also create some subtle shading. Then we'll be using it on the piston rods that we painted with Stormhost Silver. This time you'll want to focus its application around where the rod enters the barrel. This will create the effect that grease has built up here. Finally, we'll be adding the wash to the ends of the volcano cannon barrels. This will be the first step in creating the effect of heat discoloration. The next couple of steps in painting your Titan will involve painting over the armour panels that were sprayed silver as part of the priming process. As painting over metallics can be quite tricky, it's important that you thin down your paints, much like we did for the Leadbelcher step earlier. You will likely have to apply 2 or 3 layers of your paint to ensure the best coverage, but it's well worth spending that extra time to ensure that you have a solid starting colour to work from. So first of all, we'll be using Mechanicus Standard Grey to paint the armour panels found on the top of the Titan's torso, as well as those protecting the struts around the ankles. Then we can move on to painting any yellow armour panels using Ionrach Skin. Whilst this isn't a yellow paint, the reasoning behind my choice will become apparent shortly. When base coating these armour panels, don't worry too much about spilling over onto the trim, as we'll be painting over these areas later on. The important thing here is to ensure that smooth coverage. The next set of armour panels that I'll be painting will be the blue ones, and these can be found on the knee pad, the lower helmet, and also the shields that sit on the shoulders. We'll be base coating all of these areas using Macragge Blue. The final armour panel base coat to apply is one of Celestra Grey to the white panels. We'll be applying this only to the top panel of the Titan's head and also to the 2 semicircles found inside the icons on the shoulder panels. Continuing with our base coats, I will next be painting the various cable bundles found across the Warlord. To make them stand out against the more muted grey and silver colours, I'll be base coating them with Khorne Red. In this next step, we'll be applying a gradient using Dawnstone to the grey armour panels. But to do this, we'll need to make use of some Lahmian Medium. We want to mix the 2 parts of Dawnstone and Lahmian Medium together in equal quantities. Using our Dawnstone and Lahmian Medium mixture, we now want to steadily build a gradient on the grey armour panels. To do this, concentrate your application mainly to only 2/3 of each individual panel. The direction of the gradient will depend on where the panel is on the miniature. I find it helpful to imagine a light source coming from above, and wherever the light is strongest on the miniature, that is where I'll apply the gradient. After applying the first layer, allow it to dry and then apply a second layer over the top, but reduce the area that you're covering slightly so that you focus more to the lighter side of the gradient. Repeat this process again and you should be left with a smooth gradient, which will make the panels look far more interesting than if they were just flat grey. Once the gradients are finished, you can now then start to apply a wash of non-oil over all of the grey panels. This wash will flow into the recessed areas and help to give the panels some depth. In addition to washing over the grey panels, you can also use this wash on the red cables we painted earlier. Once your application of non-oil has been completely dried, you can now start to highlight the joins in the grey panels using Administratum Grey. Using a small brush and only a little paint, carefully drag your brush along the edge. This will create a thin light grey line along the edge, which will help to make those details really stand out. With the grey panels completed, we can now turn our attention to our yellow panels. So far, we've only base coated them with Ionrach Skin and they're still not looking very yellow. But before we can remedy this, we must first perform some pre-shading into the recessed areas. Using some Agrax Earthshade, you'll want to directly apply it into the panel's recesses. When applying, try not to get too much of the wash onto the flat panels themselves, as you want to keep this as light as possible. In addition to washing the recesses between the yellow panels, you can also use this on the panels that we painted using Celestra Grey earlier on. Now we can finally apply our yellow, and for this we'll be using Cassandora Yellow. However, before you go applying it straight to the miniature, you will first want to slightly thin it out using some Lahmian Medium. For this mixture, I would suggest 2 parts Cassandora Yellow to 1 part Lahmian Medium. With your mixture, we now want to paint our wash across everywhere that we painted with Ionrach Skin. When applying your yellow wash, I personally find that the more thin layers you apply, the better. You can control how intense you want the yellow to be, and you will also get a much smoother final colour than if you applied just one heavy layer. Just make sure that you allow the previous layer to dry thoroughly before applying subsequent layers. With the yellow wash completed, you can now see that the Agrax Earthshade we added earlier has subtly darkened down the recesses. In this next step, we'll be enhancing this effect with another highlight. So take a small brush with just a little watered down Dorn Yellow on the tip and very lightly drag it along those panel edges. This should result in a thin pale yellow line along your edges, much like our earlier highlight of Administratum Grey. Next, we'll be tackling the blue panels, and we'll be approaching these in much the same way that we did the grey panels. First of all, we want to create a lighter blue gradient on them, and for this, I'll be using Altdorf Calgar Blue, some Lahmian Medium, and the same gradient technique that we used earlier. The next step in painting the blue panels is to apply a wash of Drankenhof Nightshade. I personally find that out of the pot, this wash is a little too strong for our needs, so I would recommend mixing in a little Lahmian Medium to reduce its strength. To finish off those blue panels, we next want to add an edge highlight of Calgar Blue. The final set of armor panels to paint are the white ones. We've already applied the wash to the recesses, so next all we need to do is to highlight those panel edges using white scar. With the armor panels completed, we can now start to paint the golden trim around them. For this, we'll be using Retributor Armour. Take particular care when applying this layer, as you don't want to overspill onto areas that we've already painted. If you're worried about mistakes, you could use a small piece of masking tape to cover the parts of the panel that you've already painted. Following the base coat of Retributor Armour, we next want to wash over the armour trim using Reikland Flesh Shade. To finish off painting the trim, we'll now want to apply a layer of Auric Armour Gold. We only want to paint the flat areas of the trim using this paint, leaving the rivets and recesses alone. This will help to enhance the shading achieved in the previous step. At this point, your miniature could be classed as finished, but there are a few extra details you can add. The first of these are the decals. To apply decals, paint on a layer of Ardcoat to where you want the decal to be applied. Whilst it's drying, cut out and soak your decal in some water for about 30 to 60 seconds. Once the Ardcoat has dried, you can then use a damp brush to gently tease the decal away from its backing paper and into position. Once you're happy with the position, allow the decal to dry before applying another layer of Ardcoat over the top. By using the varnish in this way, you should be able to reduce any ghosting around the outside and also keep it in a fixed position. Once your decals have been applied, we can now move on to adding scratches and weathering to the armor panel's paintwork. To do this, start off by applying some thin lines of Rhinox Hide to the panel. Once the scratches have been completed, you can then use a lighter paint than the armor panel you're painting to paint a small line directly beneath it. This line will give the illusion of depth to the scratch. The paint used will depend on which colour panel you are painting. For white panels, use white scar. For blue, use Fenrisian Grey. For yellow, use Dorn Yellow again. And for the grey areas, use Ulthuan Grey. The next weathering technique to apply to the Titan are some soot stains around the various vents and the ends of the volcano cannons. To achieve this, we'll be using Abaddon Black and the same dry brushing technique that we used earlier. Simply brush on a small amount of the Abaddon Black around these areas to create the effect of scorched surfaces and soot deposits. The final step in weathering is to apply some rust stains. I'll be using a mixture of Rhinox Hide and Lahmian Medium mixed in equal quantities for this step. To apply the streaks, choose a starting point where you can imagine water would pool, such as a trim or in a scratch, and apply a small dot of the mixed paint. Rinse away any remaining paint from your brush and then pull the spot of paint directly down from its starting point. Repeat the step a couple of times so that you have a wider streak at the top, which tapers away as it moves down the armour. Once completed, your armour should look much more battle damage and weathered than before. And here we have the completed Warlord Titan. I finished things off by creating a simple basing scheme using textured paint and varnishing the components before finally assembling the Titan. You can find a full list of all the paints that I've used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other tools and equipment that I've made use of, such as my everlasting wet palette. If you enjoyed this video, do let me know in the comments below, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my Patreon page if you would like to support me in making these videos. And so the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching, and goodbye.